Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a pretty heavy but absolutely crucial topic, the seeds of empire and the death of American liberty. We're going to use the familiar epic mythology of Star Wars to objectively unpack the structural, psychological, and economic drivers of authoritarian populism. And just to be clear up front, we aren't taking any partisan sides here. We're simply going to explore how democratic institutions can slowly hollow out from the inside, leaving a completely different, much darker structure in their wake. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start off with the empire metaphor, move into the psychology of the rebellion, define exactly what Christian nationalism is, examine wealth, assets, and power, and finally map out the architecture of control. Let's get right into it. So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. You probably recognize that famous line from Star Wars, right? Well, it actually hits on a really profound historical truth. You see, democracies rarely fall because some cartoonish villain kicks down the door. They decay gradually. It usually happens when citizens actively cheer for the expansion of emergency powers, when they tolerate the scapegoating of their neighbors, and when they mistake strict domination for a restoration of order. Okay, let's look at part one, the empire metaphor. Right now, there is this undeniable feeling going around, a sense of what our source text brilliantly calls civic vertigo. It's that dizzying, disorienting sensation that the country is drifting into totally uncharted waters. And what's really crucial to note here is that this feeling crosses all party lines. Regardless of your political ideology, whether you lean left or right, we share this collective anxiety that the old, reliable assumptions about truth, power, and our shared institutions just don't feel stable anymore. And this leads us to a fascinating paradox. Think about it. Almost every modern political movement paints itself as the scrappy, underdog rebellion. They say they're fighting for decentralization, pluralism, and moral restraint. Yet the actual policies they pursue often build the exact architecture of a centralized empire. We're talking technocratic control, militarization, and fear. Every movement imagines itself as the hero. But the methods they actually use? Well, they often tell a completely different story. Moving on to part two, the psychology of the rebellion. So why do people suddenly crave a strongman? Well, historically, authoritarian systems don't just pop up out of thin air. They breed under very specific recurring conditions. We're talking intense economic anxiety, rapid cultural fragmentation, and massive technological upheaval. When you mix all that with a deep distrust in institutions and a lingering fear of national decline, populations become incredibly vulnerable. History shows us time and time again, from the Roman Republic to the Weimar Republic, that under these exact pressures, citizens almost always start begging for someone strong to just step in and fix the chaos. Big takeaway here. People literally almost never raise their hands and say, yes, please, give us a dictatorship. They're actually asking for a rescue. When everything feels broken, folks rely on emotionally powerful narratives to organize their identity and make sense of the world. Authoritarianism rarely announces itself as tyranny. It almost always arrives wearing the super comforting mask of national renewal and protection. Let's pivot to part three, defining Christian nationalism. Now, we really need to clearly define this term neutrally because it comes up a lot. We have to separate Christian nationalism from personal religious faith or everyday conservatism. As a political ideology, it's the belief that the government, the law, and our public culture should be completely fused with a specific religious vision. It makes a very definitive claim about who the nation is actually for and essentially dictates who gets to be considered a real American. And here is the massive red flag for a democracy. In a normal, healthy system, your political opponents are just, people who you think have the wrong ideas about policy. But when you fuse your politics with a sacred religious identity, suddenly compromise isn't just hard, it feels morally impossible. Policy disagreements get framed as literal spiritual warfare. When that happens, your political opponents aren't just wrong anymore, they become existential threats to the very soul of the nation. And researchers point out that this framing inherently destroys pluralism and equal protection.
All right, part four, wealth, assets, and power.
So what's the economic engine driving all this? What we're seeing is a highly effective, yet totally paradoxical alliance. On one side, you have large elite economic interests pushing hard for deregulation, tax cuts, and favorable monetary policy. On the other side, everyday supporters are driven by deep emotional concerns like identity, religion, and immigration. These two very different groups actually temporarily align into a single, massive coalition of populist energy, all backed by heavily concentrated oligarchic power. If you're wondering why everyday citizens would join that kind of coalition, you have to look at the asset economy. For decades now, and this crosses multiple administrations from both sides of the aisle, policies like artificially low interest rates have pumped up the value of stocks and real estate. This massively rewards people who already own assets. Meanwhile, everyday savers and wage earners get crushed by inflation and unaffordable housing. Decades of this structural inequality make folks feel like the system is rigged by elites, which leaves them deeply alienated and highly vulnerable to strongman narratives. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, the architecture of control. So, how does a democracy actually collapse in the real world? Today, it's rarely a dramatic military coup. It's much quieter. Authoritarian movements use perfectly lawful democratic mechanisms to hollow out the system from the inside. First, the courts become heavily politicized. Then, neutral civil servants are purged and treated like enemies of the state. Independent journalism gets reframed as literal treason. And finally, politics completely stops being a negotiation over resources and turns entirely into a moral war. You see, formal democracy can technically survive as an empty shell, while real, actual accountability is completely destroyed from the inside out. According to the research, these are the exact structural warning signs that the republic is crumbling. Forget the loud campaign slogans for a second. Watch the actual structures. Watch for loyalty replacing basic competence in government agencies. Watch for courts making laws because Congress is paralyzed. Watch for executive orders bypassing the legislature altogether. When scapegoating replaces actual policy, and when patriotism becomes an excuse to strip rights away from certain groups, that is a republic slowly transitioning into an empire that just happens to still have voting booths. At its absolute core, this entire crisis is a clash between two fundamentally different moral imaginations of what freedom actually means. One vision imagines freedom as pluralism, a shared rule that respects the dignity of people who are totally different from one another. The other vision, it imagines freedom as domination, the exclusive right of the worthy to rule, to define the nation, and to use the power of the state to enforce a strict moral order. That second vision is incredibly seductive because it promises absolute certainty. But history shows us it ultimately produces exactly what it claims to fight: domination, fear, and a very brittle, fragile society. I'm going to leave you with one final, profound question drawn straight from the text. The real danger might not even be a specific politician or a single ideology. It's this. Are we undergoing a civilization-wide drift towards systems, algorithms, echo chambers, and political structures that slowly train us to stop seeing each other as fellow humans? It's a huge question that really challenges us to reflect on the true meaning of civic identity. It reminds us that pluralism and institutions don't just survive on their own. They must be actively defended if we want to keep the republic intact. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.